we're definitely in rough waters. We're in a crisis. The crisis will get worse in the coming months, and it could get far worse. We're experiencing stagflation, meaning that there are rising prices at the same time that output is falling in many parts of the world. Europe is already in a downturn. The United States is entering a downturn. China is in some kind of economic downturn. So this is a global economic crisis. And so I regard the overall economic situation as bad as I've seen in decades, worse than in 2008. We're likely to experience some very significant shocks in the months ahead. Of course, the most crucial question is what happens to geopolitics? Does war spread? Does it intensify? Does it diminish? Is there a return to the negotiating table? Do the U.S. and China come to blows which would disrupt global society? Do they find a way to talk with each other? These are the questions that we're facing right now. In the last stagflation that we had in the late 1970s, what happened was that the inflation in the United States reached around 10% per year, and the Fed, under a 6'7", a 2-meter chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker, cigar-smoking, tough guy, he said, we're going to end this inflation, and he put interest rates up to 20%. And by the time it was over, all the developing countries were bankrupt. It was unbelievable. Well, it made my career because I spent the next decade helping countries get out of debt crisis, which had laid them completely flat. So if we go into this just with the naive financial squeeze right now, we'll end up with a lot of carnage, meaning a lot of countries in default, very high inflation rates. You look at a country like Turkey. Now, they have not managed their economy properly for years, but the inflation rate is reaching 100% per year right now. Argentina, the inflation rate is reaching 100%. There will be other countries experiencing this kind of runaway inflation. Maybe Ukraine is going to have a hyperinflation by the end of this crisis. Of course, we don't know. Of course, in the 2010s, because the European Central Bank did not do a very good job under its President Trichet in the early years of the last decade, Greece nearly went bankrupt. And it wasn't so far for Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and even Italy.
And Slovenia.
So the Eurozone and Slovenia, the Eurozone almost collapsed. Basically, the European Central Bank had to act as a lender of last resort to prevent a disaster. So central banks and their wisdom or lack of wisdom will determine a lot. In 2008, the Fed and the U.S. Treasury stupidly drove Lehman Brothers into a bankruptcy one weekend in September 2008, and it cost the whole world trillions of dollars, that technical mistake that they made. And so when you're in a crisis, the first thing to say is these institutions are not so reliable. They're not so smart. They're not so foolproof that they necessarily avoid real damage. What we need to come to the positive answer to your question is we need to avoid a contagion of defaults and a contagion of insolvencies. When I was advocating shock therapy, I was advocating that governments not print money or issue money in order to finance budget deficits. But I was constantly recommending that the international finance help the countries to avoid defaults or crises. One of the key pillars of shock therapy in Bolivia and Poland, for example, was a cancellation of the debts of those countries, the foreign debts. So I argued that to pay the foreign debts in Bolivia would have condemned the country to a rampant hyperinflation. And in the end, Bolivia's external debt to international banks was cut by about 90% at my recommendation. Similarly, in Poland, in that shock therapy, I recommended that Poland's debt overhang should be relieved. The debt that Poland owed, especially to its official creditors, should be cut very, very sharply, and that indeed happened. So I did not recommend simply austerity and contraction. I recommended always that the international counterparts, the creditors, play a role, a constructive role, a positive role in preventing crisis. Debt relief depends on the circumstances. In the circumstances today, I'm not recommending cancellation of the face value of debts. What I am recommending is that one way or another, a set of measures to make sure that the developing countries are getting more finance in fresh form than they are repaying on old debts. There are many ways to do that, but I'm basically saying don't print money. I've never believed in that because you just get high inflation, but rather let's get a financial solution that doesn't condemn the country to default or to bankruptcy or to extreme austerity. That's actually always been my policy recommendation since I started this approach in Bolivia in 1985. Currently, the 30-year bond rate of the U.S. Treasury is about 3.2%, still quite low. For German debt is still around 1%, actually. For an emerging economy, if they can get a 30-year loan, is 10%. What I'm suggesting, therefore, is a major expansion of funds coming from the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, that essentially can borrow on terms very close to what the U.S. government or German government or Japanese government can borrow, that if they are left on their own, face horrendous terms that would drive them into default.